Welcome to today's episode of Code and Country, a podcast focused on the intersection of cyber, national security, and the defense of democratic institutions. Today we're talking to Dick Fadden. Dick, welcome.
Good to be with you.
Dick, you've had a very impressive career, I have to say, both in national intelligence, security, and defense. Could you maybe introduce yourself, and for those who are not familiar, give our listeners a short version of your history?
Sure. I'm originally from Quebec. I did my university work at Université de Montréal in McGill. I'm a lawyer by training. I started my career in foreign affairs, spent a few years there, and I think that's where I developed an interest in things international. From there, I went to the Privy Council office in the Security and Intelligence Secretariat, spent a few years there. Then I bounced around the Treasury Board, Natural Resources, until I ended up back in the Privy Council office as the Security and Intelligence Coordinator, sort of the position that was the NSA before they created the NSA position, just in time to be there for 9/11. Spent a few years there, then went on to CSIS as the director for 4 years, then National Defense. Then I retired from the NSA position a few years after that. So a lot of time in national defense, national security, and foreign affairs.
You've advised prime ministers, led CSIS, been instrumental in shaping Canada's national security strategy. How would you summarize your core mission throughout your career?
Well, I think to begin at the beginning, if you're a public servant, your job is to support the government of the day. And every government, every prime minister comes in with a different kind of focus. And to be honest, in most of my career, our governments have not been particularly interested in security, defense, and foreign affairs. When I was working for Mr. Chrétien, for example, up until 9/11, it just wasn't a priority. He shifted, when 9/11 occurred. I think Mr. Harper was compelled to deal with Afghanistan. So my main preoccupation was, first, you serve the government of the day, and then you try and tell them as clearly as you can, as honestly as you can, how the world is unfolding, what the allies think of us. Are we maximizing our capacity to do this, that, or the other thing in pursuit of the national interest? And you stay on send as long as you can, but it really does depend on the other side who is on receive. And I think it's varied a great deal over the last little while. In part, I think, because most Canadians don't feel threatened. And if you don't really feel threatened, you don't worry much about security and defense and foreign affairs. Politicians are not stupid. There are not a lot of votes in national security. So it takes, to some degree, a crisis, to get them to really focus. And it's only relatively recently, you'll know as well as I do, that Canadian opinions on China have shifted to, oh my God, they're a great opportunity for selling things, to they're a strategic adversary. So it's having to deal with this ebb and flow over the years. I think that's been the challenge, to be honest.
I'm really curious how that ebb and flow has taken shape. I mean, if I think about the transition from 9/11, global war on terror, and then maybe the start of ransomware, criminally motivated cybercrime gangs. I mean, can you chart some of the key points along that journey, and just what's it been like being on the inside throughout that process?
Well, I think the first big change was when I first joined government. We were in the middle of the Cold War, at the very end of the Cold War. So the real focus of the national security community was trying to keep the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union at bay. We spent virtually all of our resources, along with our allies, on this sort of thing. Then with the fall of the Soviet Union and the Berlin Wall and whatnot, I think it's probably fair to say China wasn't yet a preoccupation. Russia sort of gave up the ghost for a little while, and we went into the period of mostly to deal with terrorism. I mean, it was a major, major preoccupation for a while, and then eventually, cyber and what we find more recently. But I think the biggest challenge from the inside is that all large institutions, I don't care if they're in the private sector or the public sector, take a while to shift. And, to get the entire community to shift away from worrying about the Cold War preoccupation with, the Warsaw Pact and shift them to terrorism was a major undertaking. And if you think about it a little bit, you went from one or two major states, Russia, trying to do what it wanted to do with the West, to a whole raft of terrorist organizations distributed across the planet. It required a shift in people, in mindset, in budgets, and relationships amongst allies. And it's slow going. And if at the same time the government of the day is not as preoccupied with this as your allies are, or you may be, it makes it a challenge. But eventually the ship of state does shift, it does move. But my main, I guess, comment would be, except when there's a major crisis, read 9/11, very slow in changing, very, very slow. And I think even today, and we may come to this later, I think the institutions of the federal government in particular have come to view cyber as the major threat. It's taken us a while to get there. And I think it's taken us equally a long time to accept that the federal government is not the sole solution to cyber. We have to involve subnational governments, the private sector, and civil society.
I'm curious with regards to our current posture, and I think cyber plays into this. Although I might ask it in a more broad context. Um, how do you feel like we're positioned when it comes to elections? And obviously, we're recording this. There's talk in the media of a potential election coming up here in Canada. Certainly, there's some goings on there. Do you feel like, though we haven't had perhaps a 9/11 level crisis, that we're prepared for being able to have fair elections, or is there still an element of risk?
I think we're more prepared than we have been, and I think there's still an element of risk. So let me divide up what concerns me into two parts. First, there's the more traditional physical part of threats to our elections. We're lucky in Canada because we don't have a great deal of electronic elections, so it's very difficult to muck up with that. We have a long experience in dealing with, you go from the polling stations to the constituencies to the chief electoral officer. I think that's going to be okay. They'll probably have a few more precautions in, but I think the real risk at one level or other is mis and disinformation. And, we've seen this not only in Canada a little bit, as the Hogg Commission has suggested, but also a great deal in the United States and in Europe. And I'm not sure that it is possible to protect ourselves to the tune of 100% from mis and disinformation. I think the chief electoral officer is doing some things, the government has done some things, and we need to implement Hogg and her recommendations. But the first step in this, I think, is the acceptance that there is a risk. We talk about it and people take precautions. And as Justice Hogg said in her report, I think the biggest risk we find today is in the pre-writ period. Political parties are basically unregulated, so anybody can muck around with who becomes a candidate. And I'm not suggesting that this is going to happen except extraordinarily, but every vote is important, and we have to find a way, I think. We need to implement C-70. You'll remember Bill C-70, which made a lot of substantive changes both to national security law and electoral law. And one of the things it did, it created the crime of foreign interference. And it prescribed a number of areas where it's now a crime. I think that's going to help. But I think more than anything, awareness, talking about these issues while governments and whomever work behind the scenes is the best way to go. But anybody who thinks we're entirely immune because we're Canada and we're not a bigger country, I think they're dreaming in Technicolor.
Well, it's funny. I mean, we hear the same thing from businesses, right? Well, I don't have data that people want to steal, therefore I'm not a target when it comes to cybersecurity. So it's interesting to hear the same perhaps the same viewpoint holds true at a national level. You mentioned just now kind of separating the threats to Canada. I mean, I'm very curious around where you see the threats, and specifically, I think sometimes when people talk about cybersecurity, they think about hackers in their basement, which might have been true 10, 20 years ago. It might still hold true today. But I'm curious, how do you see the real threats facing Canadians as well as our allies?
Well, if we stick to the cyber side of things to begin with, I think with the advent of AI, we're going to really have to worry about this a great deal more. And it is essentially, I think, mis and disinformation. I remember reading not too long ago in The Economist an example of someone from Singapore, I think it was so fooled by AI instructions that he distributed millions of dollars to various points beyond his bank. And this was a guy who knew his boss. So, so what I'm trying to say is the capacity of AI and mis and dis to generate false images of political leaders, of people who are supporting or not supporting political parties. But also, imagine if somebody decides that firm X, a major Canadian bank, a major cyber company, somebody decides they don't like them. Exactly the same thing can occur in the private sector. You use AI to send people off on a tangent. It's not very hard to reduce a company's stock value with a rumor or a couple of bits of information here and there. And as you pointed out a minute ago, I don't think the private sector and the public sector are entirely in sync on this yet. I think we've made a lot of progress. We really have. But if the private sector, generally speaking, is not willing to accept that a lot of the data and the information they have and the influence they have, which is something we forget, then it's going to be very, very hard, I think, to build up a barrier against this. And like most threats, what happens is, there's a threat, we build up a defense. It stands for a while, then the threat again jumps over us. The thing about cyber threats, it truly is evergreen. And people who think that we're going to fix it and then, we can sort of go, we don't need to worry about it, I think really need to reassess how they view this issue. A lot of people, spend a lot of time developing cyber capacity, and I'm not sure an equal number of people on the defensive side are spending as much time, money, and effort. So I think we're going to have to worry about it. But more than anything, I really believe that sunlight is the beginning of the solution to a lot of problems. We need to talk about this. And I think secondarily, one of the things that I believe is true in the private sector, it certainly was in government, is that we tend to consider when we're looking at classified information, it's all in one big clump. Well, if you're the CEO of a company, I think you need to start saying, a lot of the stuff that I'm now trying to protect, I'd like to protect it, but it ain't the end of the world if it goes. There are probably a few crown jewels in my company. I need to do something special about those. And for that to happen, you need to have a real capacity to analyze the information or the data that you're having, the risk that you're facing, and taking defensive measures at various levels. And I don't think everybody does that yet. And I think that would be the beginning of something that would be helpful. The government does it to some degree, but I'm not sure they do it quite as much as they should.
It's interesting. We saw the adoption of AI tools favoring the bad guys first. I mean, when ChatGPT first came out, one of the things that I kept reminding people is to say, hey, don't you realize that all your spam and phishing emails have suddenly gotten really perfect English, in fact, better than most native speakers? And that's because the bad guys didn't have a compliance department to slow them down from the adoption of new tools. Similarly, you referenced a deep fake attack for committing fraud or financial crime. I mean, certainly those are a lot easier and cheaper to do now than before. I'm curious, is it simply the rate of adoption that you see lacking in the government and the private sector? Is it the sophistication? I mean, when you're looking at this kind of at the with the balance of power of who is leveraging AI tools, is it a speed? Is it expertise in these areas? What's the blocker for the good guys to be able to adopt these things?
That's a very good question. I think in part our adversaries have an advantage because when they see the possibility of using a tool against their adversaries, they allocate a lot of money, a lot of brain power, and a lot of energy. And they do it in an uncontrolled manner. And I think that's one of the big problems that we have. Yes, we've identified the issue. Yes, we've spent a bit more money and a bit more energy. But I think their capacity to pivot, to be honest, is better than ours. And I think their capacity to allocate resources of all sorts is much better than ours. But we equally, not just in the cyber area, but in any area relating to national security, we have more constitutional, legal, and ethical controls than they even dream of. And it does slow us down. I'm not advocating the removal of these controls, but sometimes I think we should take a deep breath and look at them in the aggregate to see if all of them are necessary. And it seems to me that Canada, in particular, has more of these controls, some of them in the last category of ethical and moral, than most countries. And they're there for a reason. I respect people who believe in them. But at the same time, sometimes you have to rethink what you can't do and find other ways of doing it to be able to move the file. I used to joke when I was still working that Parliament created the national security agencies with a view of promoting the national security, not to provide opportunities for review, audit, and oversight. And I'm exaggerating to make my point, but there's some truth to that sometimes in the minds of some. And again, I'm not advocating the removal of these controls, but when our adversaries are progressing so quickly, I think we need to find the capacity to shift a little bit ourselves in order to be able to push back.
Sticking on the emerging technology theme, maybe looking at one that is further up the adoption curve, I'm curious about quantum. Quantum, in my mind, I kind of break it down as saying that if quantum computing, if the promise of quantum computing turns out to be real, if we're able to get quantum computers, one of the most obvious and most talked about impacts of that is it'll be able to break traditional encryption, and will kind of render traditional methods of keeping data safe a bit moot. I'm curious, because we're not there yet, unlike AI is here and we're having to deal with it. Quantum is potentially still a little ways away. Different people have disputes on exactly how far away we are, whether it is going to get here at all, etc. Maybe I'd love your perspective on both governments as well as private sector participants. What, in your view, should we be doing now, today, in light of this potential risk, which is quantum computing?
Well, I think, first of all, once again, I think we need to acknowledge that it's coming. I don't think we're as advanced in dealing intellectually with quantum as we are with AI. And we're not going to deal with it effectively if we don't admit that it's potentially a real problem. I mean, quantum in a different environment, in a different way, can be very helpful to humanity. But the same rules that apply to cyber or AI, I think, apply to quantum. And I think equally, we're going to find some ways of resisting these kinds of encryptment, but we're going to move forward in lockstep again with our adversaries. But, I'm reminded when I was still working, the leader of one of the West's most distinguished intelligence services told me over lunch once, it's gotten so bad, the capacity of our adversaries to intercept instructions, that they had now taken, in exceptional circumstances, putting something in a briefcase and giving it to somebody and putting them on the plane and sending it over physically. Sort of the image of the World War II films of an officer courier. Now, this was quite a few years ago, but I think the same thing, we need to think about how we're going to deal with information that we consider to be absolutely critical. Air gapping ain't perfect, but air gap can go a long way to protecting information. It certainly can today. And if people can't get at the information or the data that you're worried about, then they're not going to be able to use quantum or anything else to get at it. I'm oversimplifying because I know air gapping isn't perfect. But we have to start, I think, spending some money and intellectual capacity looking at both the positive and the negative of quantum. And in the West, we have a tendency of initially just looking at the positive sides of things. That computing capacity boggles the mind. I can't claim to be able to get my head around it, but it should enable us to solve all sorts of problems that we currently have. Our adversaries are doing that, but they're also doing it in the most offensive way that they can possibly come up with to attack us with it. I think we have to find a way to galvanize the private sector, civil society, and governments together to look at quantum maybe in a slightly more neutral way, not entirely defensive, not entirely offensive, but to recognize that if we don't find a way to deal with it, and you're quite right when you say we ain't quite there yet, but I don't think it's 30 years away either. So if we don't find a way of working together, both within a particular country and within alliances, I think we're going to be at a disadvantage once again until we catch up. We will inevitably catch up unless the world situation deteriorates more than I think any of us hope it will. But I think I think that's the main issue that we have. We're going to focus initially on the positive side when we should be focusing on both sides.
It's interesting. I've noticed the start of a trend over the last 12 to 24 months of predominantly private sector companies starting to ask questions around quantum preparedness. I think previous to that, quantum computing and post quantum cryptography as a specific element within that was kind of regulated to maybe some of the intelligence community or central banks or a very very niche audience. And I think now what I'm noticing, and in fact, even we had a conversation earlier today with about one of our clients who's starting to ask questions around getting ready for quantum Q day. That day at which quantum computers turn out to be real, and then suddenly, what do you do? What happens to all your cryptography? What is the order and sequence of cryptography that you have to replace? Which ones are going to be more susceptible than others? Which ones are effectively instantaneously going to be able to be broken? And then also, how much data has been harvested?
Mm-hmm.
By either by nation states or other criminal groups who perhaps are betting that quantum will turn out to be real, and they are stockpiling data for that eventuality. Um, Sticking to maybe another risk that might affect us. I know that last September you'd led a delegation of former defense and I think intelligence officials to Taipei. Um, with your engagement in the regional security discussions, I'm curious, how do you assess the risk and likelihood of a potential invasion of Taiwan?
I don't think there's a perfect answer to that, but I don't think it's imminent in the short to medium term. And people in the military who know more about this than I do tell me that right now China would have a great deal of difficulty invading Taiwan in the traditional sense. It would require, passage across the Straits of Taiwan. The defenses of Taiwan are being built up in a not inconsiderable way. The Americans have indicated, even with President Trump, that they're prepared to defend Taiwan. But I think the more important reason that they're unlikely to do it unless they're pushed into it is an invasion of Taiwan by China will be viewed as a bellwether of Chinese behavior elsewhere. And it would scare the living daylights out of a whole raft of country in Asia, and I think immediately get their backs up against China. Every country from Japan to Indonesia to the Philippines would view an invasion of Taiwan as an indication of what is possible for China, and they would worry about themselves, I think. This would not be good news, I think, for China, because I don't think they necessarily want to gridlock the entire Asian Indo-Pacific, nor do they want to necessarily take over countries other than possibly Taiwan. So I think they're more concerned with maintaining a balance and possibly continuing to squeeze as opposed to invade Taiwan. I mean, let's call a spade a shovel. In no shape, way, or fashion, I'm dating myself, in no shape, way, or fashion is Taiwan a strategic threat to China. It is in no way a worry of any sort. All it is a political commitment that has been reinforced with successive leaders of China that they have to do something about it, despite the fact that large chunks of the world don't agree with their claim on Taiwan. So, to shorten my answer, I think for the bellwether reason more than anything else, they would hesitate to do this because it would change the impression of China on the part of a large number of countries in a way that they would not want. They would prefer to be a little bit more subtle and a little bit more sophisticated.
I think over the last couple of weeks, we've seen some movement, both from the Americans as well as the Conservative Party in Canada, looking to take a different tact on foreign affairs and national security. I'm curious, how do you see the trend line either moving or changing when it comes to the role of governments and what they should play in national security versus the role of the private sector? Do you see that the private sector is going to become more important to national security, less, more reliance placed upon it, less? If you were able to look in your crystal ball, what would you see?
Well, let me start at a sort of a meta level. I think national security is promoted by governments when they can perceive a threat to the sovereignty of their country. And to not include economics in this, I think, is dreaming in technicolor. I mean, I think some of the things that the current US president is advocating clearly is a threat to our sovereignty and our economic sovereignty. Same thing with a number of other countries. So I think the definition is broadening. Governments are becoming increasingly aware that the economic sides of things has a real place in the definition of national security. As you may know, Ian, I've been arguing for years that there's no such thing as national security. You have to involve things international and subnational and the private sector and civil society. So I think the more that we involve the economic side of things, and I define that broadly to include, international economics all the way to trade policy, you have to involve the private sector because they're the ones that are the generators there. It is not the government that is generating, the private sector. They have a role, they may establish guardrails, they may provide incentives or disincentives, but it's the private sector. So how, to draw on a current example, the current U.S. president has invoked national security reasons to impose tariffs on some Canadian products, aluminum and iron again, steel, I mean. I think it stretches credulity to argue that there's any real national security rationale that is substantive behind those arguments, but it's entirely in the commercial or economic field. So, just one small example of how I think economics can significantly, in fact, impact a country's sovereignty, and thus should be included in the definition of national security. And I absolutely believe that governments at all levels, private sector, and civil society. By civil society, for example, I include research universities and research centers and think tanks. They have a role to play as well. And I guess I would argue that while we're getting better at it in Canada, we're not as well integrated as we could be. Part of it, if you'll forgive me for not being entirely positive about the private sector, is that until relatively recently, it took a lot of doing to engage leaders in the private sector on national security issues. I admit it's changing, and I think that's good news, but it's taken a while. Universities and think tanks, on the other hand, are so jealous of their independence and their capacity to function, don't really want to necessarily always talk with the private sector governments. And governments, well, for the longest time, they were solely accountable for national security. So I think we have to find a way to break down these barriers, in particular to deal with the economic sides of things that you were asking about.
And on that note, thinking about the bigger picture, what keeps you up at night?
That's a good question. I thought about that a lot. I think it's the breakdown of the international rules based order that we have benefited from since World War II. I think the current US president is smashing that with glee. And I don't think we've yet imagined the consequences of that yet. I think one of the real advantages the US had since World War II, is that they had real allies. The definition of allies, to my mind, or alliance, to my mind, are countries that trust one another. I think the trust level within the West right now, is being rapidly diminished as Mr. Trump sort of goes here and there, ignoring international law. He clearly is violating international law. I mean, the trade deal that we have with Mexico and the United States would clearly preclude the imposing of tariffs in the manner that he's done. Also, a clear violation of international law in the context of the WTO, although it's sort of moribund right now. So it's really all of the factors that are pulled together that are going to destroy international law as we know it. I mean, another example will be there are 4 or 5 countries in the Middle East who bomb 5 or 6 other countries with immunity, without any declaration of war. Yes, the international law accepts the argument of, long-term defense gives you the right to be offensive. But my goodness, a few years ago, when somebody bombed another country, that was equivalent to declaring war. But, the Israelis have moved into Syria, the Americans and the Brits are, bombing Yemen, and I could go on for a few minutes. I understand there are reasons behind all of these activities, but it's really this breakdown of what we have come to benefit from in Canada in massive ways. of the international rules-based order.
Well, with that, Dick, I just want to say thank you both for your service to the country as well as your willingness to speak truth to power, both as I've seen you done in the past as well as join us here on the show. So thank you.
It was good talking to you.